Good evening to everyone. I hope you are all doing fine. This is Rekha Menon here from the National Skill Development Corporation. On behalf of NSDC and my colleagues, I welcome you all for the second webinar on assessing critical thinking, a test developer's point of view. And I welcome our speaker today, Mr. Douglas Baldwin, the Senior Strategic Advisor, Assessment and Learning Technology Development from the Educational Testing Services, ETS. The last webinar on best practices in test development was well received by the participants, with the representatives from the Sector Skill Council, the assessment agencies, and our internal NSDC various business team. Post the webinar, we have also shared the materials with all the attendees, and I hope you all might have received the same. Our speaker was kind enough to share the materials and have also agreed to address any of your queries through email. In case if anyone wants to reach out to Doug, then may write to him. We will share his email ID at the end of the session. So today's session we have structured in such a way that we would request Doug to take us through the session on how critical thinking can be assessed with a focus on general principles around constructed response test design and scoring. We would request the attendees of the webinar to kindly post your questions on the Q&A session, and we'll take the questions at the end of the presentation. We look forward to today's session, and I hope you will all find this session relevant and useful. Now I would request Doug, our speaker for today, to kindly take us through his presentation. Thank
And
you,
I'll
Doug,
say,
and welcome.
thank you. And about to say good morning, and then I realized, no, I should say good evening. But for me, it's still early in the morning. I'm still waking up. Um, I'm really looking forward to another conversation. I'll say two things that I say all the time. Please, as you just heard, feel free to ask questions at any point on any topic. Anything I cannot answer today, I will get back to you. And yes, you can always write me directly at my email and I will answer. So just so we're clear on that. The other point I would make is that I'll say this a lot. If you go to the ets.org website, you can see there all of our major tests. There's quite a lot there. And if you go look through on any given test, you'll see how we communicate everything from scoring guides to job description, to task descriptions, and that can inform things. So I'm going to try to share my screen. I'm always a little bit slow at that, and see if I can find our presentation. And let's see. Is that now visible to people?
Yes, we can
Good.
see your screen.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about critical thinking. Many times in the last 10 years I've been at conferences, critical thinking is seen as, well, critical to the job market. Employers want people who can think critically because, unlike, say, 50 years ago, things change so rapidly that being able to learn is more important than having learned, if that makes sense. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's a tough construct to assess, and we'll talk about that. And we'll keep in mind something we brought up briefly the other day, which is there are two basic ways to ask questions. One are what used to be called multiple choice. We tend to call it selected response. And the other is constructed response. And part of what we'll cover today is talking about constructed response, which I gather is very common in a lot of your employment tests where you have a kind of performance assessment, a kind of oral exam. And we'll talk about that. So without spending a lot of time on the definition, just the main point is that critical thinking is multidisciplinary. It's not like it's a single field that you teach it in. You teach it across the curriculum. And in that sense, it's very similar as when we teach writing. It used to be writing was only taught in the English classes, and now we're recognizing it's something that should be taught in the history class, even the science class, even the math class. So that's a guiding assumption. It's hard to define it, and that's one of the things that's interesting about all of what we say about test development. And we talked about evidence-centered design last week. The trick is to figure out exactly what it is you're measuring, what is it you want to know, and then you figure out how you're going to do it. It is a complex, multidimensional, multifaceted. You really have to decide what you're going to test. And the third bullet on this slide is crucial to everything we're going to ever say about testing, which is it's always a piece of the construct. You always have to decide, okay, out of all the body of knowledge involved with whatever the task is, the employment, the discipline, the academic skill, you have to reduce it to something you can test. And so you have to think, what is it we're going to use in our test? And that's just an important point. It's a reality that you have to keep in mind. Now, this is what I just said a few minutes ago. You have to decide, is it selected response versus constructed response? And the issue for us, and the test I'm going to look at today, we ended up, because of logistics, which is both the cost and the amount of testing time available to the students, we ended up using selected response. But one of my points would be that if you have the money, the time, and the scoring, constructed response allows you to see more about how a test taker is thinking and where they're going wrong and where they're going right, as opposed to just choosing answers. And the other part about a constraint for a test is validating it. So how do we know we have tested the right thing? And so you could look at their grade point average, you could look at how long they spend to get to degree, you could see whether they're placed in a job market. These are ways of validating any test. And we didn't get to validity and fairness and reliability, though it's in my other slides. And again, I welcome you to read through these materials at your leisure and get back to me with questions as you think of them. So what we did, we had a framework where we tried to define the construct. We talked about item types, the format of the items, and that all led us to building test specs. Now, there are many different ways we could have done this. In this case, this was a framework. I don't expect you to read this, but the point is we went through a lot of literature, a lot of materials, attended a lot of conferences, and tried to determine what is the construct. And we came up with this as a definition. It's a habit of mind characterized by the comprehensive exploration of issues, ideas and assumptions, artifacts, data, and events, all before accepting or formulating an opinion or a hypothesis or a conclusion. So that's what we use for our construct definition. That isn't to say this is the only one, but it's what we decided. We then said, okay, there are sub-competencies, and in the evidence-centered design process, you define the construct and then all the sub-competencies. And so some were to formulate a statement of the issues, define a problem. We looked at evaluating evidence and data, considering context and assumptions, being able to propose an interpretation or a perspective or a model or hypothesis, and to articulate arguments, conclusions, implications, or solutions. So this test called HEIGHTEN, the HEI is higher educational institutions, we're using for students who are graduating from college, undergraduate college, and it's what we call a student learning outcomes. Have they learned critical thinking during their time in college? And we broke it into two kinds of skills, analytical and synthetic. And so we report two subscores. We report analytical scores and synthetic at the group level. So for analyze, can they analyze an argument and evaluate the structure? And for synthetic, can they develop valid or sound arguments and understand the implications or consequences? Now, you can do this with one of two ways. As I said before, you could do multiple choice or you could do constructive response. And in our case, we took the former. So one way we developed some of the items on here, and this is what this slide is we will use reading comprehension critical thinking sets. So we gave pieces of reading in different areas and asked questions about the logical reasoning and the analytical reasoning that informed the arguments proposed in this. The context we chose from across the disciplines. The reason for this is if you were an undergraduate who majored in social science and every question came from natural science, you might feel that it wasn't fair. Now, we never test outside knowledge of any of these fields, but the face validity of the test is better when test takers see questions coming from different contexts. So that makes sense. Let me stop here for a second. Have we have any questions up to now that I can address? I am going through this quickly.
Doug, hi, this is Bhumika. We can go ahead.
Okay.
No questions as of now.
All right. And if we have time later, or I can send separately, or actually, if you go into the ets.org website, there'll be actual passages with questions that represent the kinds of items we ask. And this really is what I'm going to keep suggesting you do, because in a quick, for me, morning, for you, evening presentation, you're not going to have the time to really think through how these questions are written. And the best is to see them on the site. So the constructive response is any kind of performance assessment. The idea is test takers have to demonstrate what they know rather than just selecting. They're called often open-ended, free response. They're considered direct or authentic. For many years, we tested written communication with multiple choice questions. We would give a sentence and say, identify the grammatical error. Now that is okay. It correlates very well with writing, but you're not directly measuring somebody's ability to write, but you're doing indirect measurement of do they recognize grammatical errors, and that relates to reading. Anyway, that's for most common for constructive response that ETS works with, tends to measure either specific content, like the AP tests that measure college level learning in a 37 different subjects from biology to calculus to English literature. But there also are performance assessments. And I gather some number of you do some number of what I would call performance assessments, where you're interviewing or talking to test takers and asking them to describe or explain. That is a trickier one to standardize, and we mentioned this last Tuesday, but it's also can be a very valuable way to get at it. Another kind of performance assessment would be to ask a test taker or employee or a trainer or whatever it is to actually do whatever it is you want them to be able to do. So in the Olympics, you have diving, and you have a set of criteria by which you evaluate a dive. You could evaluate how well a plumber can weld a copper pipe that needs to be, that has a leak. That could be a performance. The tricky thing about performance is you have to have very clear criteria. And so one thing to keep in mind is anything I say about scoring guides for the test we're looking at today can be applied by principals to the any kind of performance assessment. And yesterday afternoon, I sent a document called Guidelines for Best Practices in Constructive Response and Other Performance Assessments, and you can read that. It's also on the ets.org site. So when we talk about selective response versus constructive response, the positive aspect of selective response is you can cover much more of the construct. If you have a single essay question asking somebody to explain the events that took place leading up to World War II, that's one question can take 30 minutes, and you don't really know if they know anything about any other war or any other period of history or any other events. And so you can't cover the construct as well, where multiple choice, you can ask 100 questions in the same time that cover the whole construct. It's a lot easier to talk about the results because you can say there were 100 questions covering 200 years of US history, and they got 73 of them correct. I mean, it's easy to talk about. And there is objective and very efficient and inexpensive and reliable scoring. But a point I made last week, which I'm putting right here again, just remember, though, that selective response by itself doesn't mean that it's objective. and I gave an example of a question that that's not an objective question. You could say the answer is, well, I don't even know what the answer is, but that would be a subjective decision. So you're really measuring a subjective point of view, not an objective. So I just gave that here. Now, I give workshops on how to write items for our new people at ETS, and when I work at the Global Institute, other countries come and want to know. And if we ever have time, I can do that here. But for today, I just wanted to give one example. If you go online, you can look up multiple choice or selected response item writing, you will find numerous college level definitions, explanations. And this one book I like a lot does a very good job of laying out how to write multiple choice items. But there are many, many others like that. So that's selected response. And again, with time, we can look at some. As I say, you have to decide which is better. Both have advantages, and you have to choose the right one. I've explained some of the cons of selected response because they can seem more like Jeopardy questions. It's harder to do, but performance is, I've got a typo there. That's a bad performance. Let me move this in here. Performance assessments tend to require a constructive response, because to say to someone, tell me how you would drive a car, the person could say really right things, and I do this and I do that, but you don't in fact know whether they can do it. So performance tends to require, generally, constructive response. That's just sort of a obvious point, but people forget that. But you can do a lot with SR. It's just that there are limits to it. Okay. So constructive response can be any number of things. It could be a very short answer. It can be a long essay. It can be play an instrument. It could be give a speech. It could be demonstrate how to do a complicated electrical performance. And it can even just be a numeric entry, where you give a math question, but instead of letting them choose, they write in the answer. So those are basic examples. So if you're going to do constructive response, you go through this checklist. Again, it's very easy just to write a question and not have gone through what the thinking behind it. So you have to decide, what is it you're trying to assess? Is it knowledge about electricity? Is it ability to actually twist a wire so that it doesn't come untwisted? What is it you want to know? You then must really define the task completely and specifically. When I taught high school, one of the things we heard about were teachers who would ask a question like this: go get me a rock. And okay, come back. Nope, not a small rock, a big rock. Okay, not a green rock, but a red rock. Oh, okay. The question didn't tell the student really what you were trying to get. It's not fair to say to someone, talk about New Delhi. Well, what do you want to know? I mean, that's not a fair question. You can't say, explain why this is a good idea, and then say, you only gave one example. You're supposed to give 3. If you want 3, you have to say 3. If you're going to score it on grammar, you have to say, be sure to use the best grammar you can. The point is, you need to define the task. It needs to be done completely and specifically. As I said, I think on Thursday, it's very easy to write bad questions. We had one constructive response question in California some years ago before I started, where we said, okay, and this was a major essay for the SAT, really important test. Please discuss the best music, your favorite music. Sounds like a good question. Give the reasons you like it, explain why it's good, and try to write a convincing essay explaining why this is the best music to listen to. And a student wrote, I'm deaf. I don't listen to music. That was his whole essay. Well, that question obviously was not a good question from a fairness point of view, or from, did not work for everyone. So you obviously have to think through, what is it? Are you giving everyone an equal opportunity? You wouldn't say, describe how filibusters work if what you're trying to do is measure somebody's ability to write an argument, because if you don't know what a filibuster is, it's a weird U.S. legal procedure in the Senate, well, then that's not a fair question. On the other hand, if it's a U.S. history test, a U.S. political government test, that'd be a fine question because you expect them to know that. Oops, sorry about that. Definitely give explicit directions. What is the length, the grading guidelines? You will have 20 minutes to write an essay. Somewhere in the materials, it should be, we expect something in the neighborhood of a paragraph or 4 paragraphs or whatever it is you want. The fourth bullet is a big one. It's we call scoring guides or rubrics. You need to develop one and apply it appropriately. And then we ask our test developers to see if they can't answer the question themselves. Can they do it? Before you ask someone to rewire something as a test, make sure you know how you would do it yourself and that it can be done. It's very easy to ask a question that turns out to be hard to answer. Okay, so here's one that we use. We use this in a critical thinking, in a written communication test. It's based on one we use in the graduate record exams for applying to graduate school. We write these arguments, kind of example. We explain where it comes from, so there's some context. The following argument appeared. It's an opinion piece, and it gives an argument and comes up with a position. We'd be better off with less choice. This is what we would call the stimulus. It can be a picture, a video, a broadcast, but generally in these we have some kind of writing. And then we say, in a well-organized, so we're telling the test taker, organize it, it's a letter. Okay, now they know what the task is, written to the local newspaper. Use your understanding of the above argument to develop your own position on whether we should all be better off with less choice. So there's a very clearly delineated what we expect the student to do. And we say, support your argument with reasons and examples from. It can be your own experience, your observations, any reading, or analysis of the reasoning in the above argument. That's a very clear set of expectations. And as I say, anyone who takes this test has had a chance to look through the materials and see sample responses that are not so good, that are medium, and that are very good, with annotations saying this is why. So this is what I would call a good example of a clear, constructive response. It's measuring writing and analysis. Any questions up to here? Good. All right. I'll take silence as things are okay. There are there are more than two, but there are two main types of ways of scoring. And this is primarily for writing, but it works for performance as well. One is holistic. This is something that actually was developed at ETS in the early 60s. It used to be spelled with a WH, as in the whole thing. That's where it comes from. And it's one score based on an overall impression of a student's performance. Now, this can be done with a test of diving, a test of driving, a test of music. The idea is you simply listen to the entire performance, watch the entire performance, read the entire essay, say overall, on a 6-point scale, this is about a 5. Pretty good, not as good as a 6, definitely above average. 4 would be, we'll say, adequate. 3 would not be adequate. A 5 would be above proficient, and a 6 would be exemplary or outstanding. That's a holistic approach. There are a lot of advantages to it, and it's the most common for assessing large numbers of performances because you can do it fairly quickly. and one person can read the whole essay and give an overall impression. I used to tell people that it's a little bit like saying to someone after get off the plane, after flying across the country, how was your flight? You give an overall, yeah, it was a good flight. Now, there are many aspects to it. Did it take off on time? Did it crash? Was the food good? All of these are factors, but you don't list them all. You simply say, overall, how was it? The other kind of scoring, on the other hand, tries to have you identify different features. It's called analytic. Some people call it trait. Some people call it multidimensional. And this is where you get feedback along different dimensions or traits. Now, for performance assessment of an employment skill, I would think there are a lot of good reasons why trait scoring, analytic scoring might be preferable, because then you can say you've got the skills to do this, this, and this, but the one skill you're lacking is that. Here's where you need to work. So if any kind of formative assessment, any kind of assessment where you want to give feedback, trait scoring works better. It costs more because you have to give more scores. It takes longer, but it has some great usefulness depending on what you're doing. If you're just writing an essay to get into graduate school, knowing that you have weak grammar or not isn't really the point, just how is your writing overall. But if you're a high school student who's trying to improve his writing, it might be that you do want to hear your organization's good, your examples are not good, your grammar is not good, or whatever it is. So that's called analytic. And I'll show you a couple examples of each. Again, any questions? So here is a sample.
No doubt.
Yes.
Please carry on.
Go ahead. What'd you say?
No, there no question as of now. We'll take it towards the end.
Okay, good. So I'm going to show two sample holistic rubrics. This one gives a score range of 0 through 3. If you look at the 0, I know it's starting at the bottom. This is not where somebody gets it wrong, usually, as much as blank or off topic or just completely, just not even on the topic at all, in that sense incorrect, or just rewrites the question. So generally, depending on a lot of rubrics, the 0 point is really almost like a non-response. The others, there's 3 points. A 3, if you look, is successful in different ways. A 2, some understanding, but it's limited. 1, seriously flawed. Then you can further see that underneath each of those big descriptors are a series of 4 bullets that are parallel. So the first bullet under a 3, ability to analyze the stimulus thoughtfully and in depth. A 2 might have a misreading of the stimulus or might be superficial analysis. And a 1, weak understanding of the matter. So you can see these rubrics are very carefully constructed so that there's a series of bullets with descriptors hierarchically arranged. So a 3 has the best, a 2 has something weak, a 1 even more so. And also they're parallel, and the first one's the ability to analyze. The second bullet is knowledge of the subject matter. The third bullet responds appropriately to all parts. And the last bullet, the conventions of standard written English. Then the 2 has the same bullets in the same order with different descriptors, as does the 1. One important point about this is usually in these kinds of rubrics, the first bullet is the most important one to the teachers who came up with this exam and this construct. And the last bullet is the least important. And the reason I say that is, in general, conventions of standard written English are important, but they aren't the essential part as much as thinking thoughtfully and in depth. You could give a test in which grammar was the most important thing, and that could be how you measured it. And I'll show you with a trait scoring what that might look like. Here's another one. This is a 6-point scale. It goes from outstanding all the way down to fundamentally deficient. TOEFL has a 5-point scale, but a lot of tests like to have a 6-point in that you can have an upper half and a lower half without there being a middle point. The danger with a 5-point can be that raters tend to go towards the middle one, the safe 3, because it's right in between. Where on the 6-point, you either are adequate, 4 or better, or you're limited, 3 or worse. Again, the bullets go, if you look at it, and you can, these will be available to you. You can look at these at greater length. This is very much like a GRE, very much like an SAT, or the old SAT, a very typical kind of scoring scale. There are scales. I worked in England that they had a 23-point scale, which was so hard to figure out because you can't make that many distinctions. On the other hand, a 4-point scale, which is common in the K-12 world, it's almost too limited. So 6 comes out to be a nice number for that. But again, you'll see it has a title: outstanding, strong, adequate, limited, flawed, and seriously flawed and fundamentally deficient. Each has a descriptor. Each says a typical response and then gives bullets, and they're all parallel. And holistic scoring works incredibly well. Raters who don't all agree with each other on what makes a good essay, after training and with sample benchmarks, can do a very good job of reading, a couple pages of a 2-page essay in a matter of a couple of minutes and feel comfortable knowing what the score is. So that's holistic. Analytic, on the other hand, tries to give different elements and then gives scores on each of that. And in this scoring, I don't even remember what this one comes from. There's a 3-point scale, 1, 2, and 3. There are 3 areas: analysis, subject matter, and mechanics. That way, a test taker can get a score saying you have very strong knowledge of the subject matter. Your analysis, it's not that good, but you have severe and persistent errors in mechanics. Then a teacher can say to that student, you need to work first on your mechanics, you need to work on your analysis, you definitely understand the subject matter. So that's a sample, very simple analytic rubric. What's a little bit confusing is that a rater who reads a paper has to give 3 different scores, and in some sense, each of those scores, and I don't want to confuse things, it'll sound funny, but each score is really a holistic score of a trait. So he finishes the whole paper and say, overall, the mechanics were, and that's like a holistic score, but just of one trait or one dimension. I'll go one more. This is a more developed one. It's multidimensional, analytical, trait rubric. Again, you have analysis, development, and mechanics. It's 4-point scale. It goes through each point, again, in parallel, on competence in analyzing, how good the analysis is, gives more specifics, aspects of the argument, analyzes them. Now, for a performance assessment, that might be a better way to go, because then you can say your mechanical skills in connecting the wires were fine, but your conceptual understanding of the more efficient way to put in the outlets was not as good. So here's a skill you need to practice more of. That's the kind of thing you can look at. We used to have something that's like trait scoring called core scoring, where to get an adequate score, you have to do a couple things, essential things. Then, if you do other things, you can get it slightly higher. So, for instance, if you're an emergency medical technician, an EMT, kind of important that the person's still breathing, kind of important that you stop the bleeding. Those are the essentials. If you don't do that, it doesn't matter what else you do, you're not going to pass. You're not going to reach your cut score. If you put a pillow under the patient's head, well, that's good. That's nice. That can make it a little bit stronger. But if you haven't kept the patient alive, the pillow doesn't really matter. That's supposed to be somewhat humorous, but we'll see. So here are advantages of each. I've sort of gotten at this. Holistic are quick scoring, overview, no detailed information. That's what a holistic rubric is. In a classroom teaching, I would very rarely use holistic. because I want the student to know where to work, where to prove their writing. Analytic, you get more detailed feedback, more consistent scoring, but the disadvantage is it's more time consuming. And I'm guessing that Analytic Rubric's already said that. At the bottom, I added that note that performance assessments probably make more sense to go with Analytic, unlike, say, written communication. The scoring guide is absolutely important. You have to communicate what you're expecting, define your purpose, makes you consistent, ensures validity of your assignments. Now, this slide is aimed more for teachers, but as at bottom I have added again, it can direct the test taker to focus on certain specific skills that need improvement. I'm mentioning this because this has come up a few times. Starting in 1999, I think, ETS began using a computer software program developed by computational linguistics experts in what we call the Natural Processing Language Group in research, developed software to, in a sense, score essays. Since '99, we've been using it we used to use it for GMAT, the test to get into graduate business schools. We use it for the graduate record exam. We use it for TOEFL. We use it for TOEFL writing and TOEFL speaking. And we use it for a variety of K-12 tests. And I noticed some of the materials that have been shared with you talk about automated scoring in the K-12 environment. The main comments to make here are that software programs like this can be remarkably accurate, but they are not actually reading. They're not evaluating. They're doing something like that. So they can be fooled fairly easily. What we do for our high stakes programs, however, is every essay is read also by a human, and that keeps the kind of fabricated responses that aren't really any good, which might get a high score from a computer, from getting a high score because the human overrides that. But it does allow for extremely inexpensive, rapid scoring of responses. I mean, it's basically instantaneous. And if you go to the ets.org site and look up, it's called E-Rater, as an essay rater, there's dozens and dozens of research articles on that. There's by the way, my ETS email. Any questions? That's the slides I prepared for today. If you're interested, we can do others or we can just talk.
Hi, Doug. There's one question that we have received. We would like you to take. It's on, is it possible to measure constructive response by asking one simple question?
Well, you're not constructive response is a kind of item. It's not a construct. So can you use constructive response to find out something with one simple question? If all you want to find out is can they write down the name of the country that is north of the United States, yeah, you could find out whether they know that. You could do it with multiple choice more efficiently. But you can't find out a lot. I mean, it depends on the question, depends on the construct, what it is you're trying to measure. I'm not sure I'm answering it because I'm not really sure what's being asked.
Okay, so going forward, we have question on, you mentioned about rubrics. We were thinking if you could touch upon the process of rubric development. What are the salient steps that you see are really needed in the process of developing a suitable rubric for scoring a constructed response?
And
if you
rubrics,
could throw
by the
some
way,
light on it, yes.
Yeah, and I showed some good scoring guides, ones that are there. I don't have bad scoring guides. Just I was going to make one up last night, and I just thought, no, I don't need to. But a good score, the first thing to realize about developing any kind of assessment, and this goes back to the slides I showed last week, it's not linear, it's cyclical, and it's really true of constructive response. So if you've never given this assessment before and you're still working it out, the whole development starts with that, again, the evidence-centered design. What precisely is the construct and what is the evidence that would support the claims that we're making about the construct? Then you work with different questions to see if it, or different tasks, and see if it elicits what it is you're trying to measure. And then you try to come up with, okay, here we have 20 different, we're just going to pilot this assessment, see what happens. Here are 20 responses. What is it about each that makes it seem to us to be what we want to say is a good performance or a medium performance or a poor performance? Okay, now let's come up with descriptors. So this is a long process, and it's iterative in that you come up with the first scoring guide, and then you start to work with it, and then you find out, you know what, when a rater reads the scoring guide, he doesn't know what to do with this kind of response. We better put in, what do you do when the respondent does something? And so you have to keep working until you come up with, all right, now we have a very stable guide. Let's try it out with 100 responses, okay, and see if there's any concerns. So for instance, recently we had a test. It was a high school equivalency, so that if you didn't go to high school but you wanted a degree, we had an essay, and the essay had two different sources. That is the stimuli, the material for one question. There was a passage that would say driver's licenses should be limited to people who are over 21. Another one that argued, no, you should be able to drive as soon as you are 15, we'll say. That's not a very good example, but we had a paragraph on each, or we'd have two sources about causes of the American Civil War, one that attributed it to one cause, another to another. The idea is that there are two sources, and the student is asked to synthesize those two sources and write a response, presenting his or her own viewpoint. Looked really good. In the scoring guide, we said, we asked them to use both sources, and they decided if you did not cite specifically both sources, you wouldn't get an upper half. That seemed reasonable. But when they started to put it into practice, it turned out a lot of students didn't mention one of the sources, but it was clear they were responding to it. They didn't know they needed literally to cite each source. And so a lot of students were getting lower half, non-passing scores, who really were very strong performers. And so we right now are going to change the rubric, and you can't do that very lightly for a test that's already in operation. You can definitely do it when you're developing and piloting one. So that would be an example of a rubric that did not do what we wanted it to do. Now, with an employment, I would assume you really have to decide exactly what is the task and what are the criteria. Because if you say to someone, fix the leak, and they put a piece of duct tape around it, and it kind of fixes it for the next 10 minutes, you might want to say, well, that's not what I meant by fix the leak. It needs to be fixed permanently. Or if you, again, you want to say, whatever it is, you need to go through very carefully what it is you're measuring and then get descriptors. You also have to decide how many levels are you trying to evaluate. You're just doing a pass-fail, are you trying to have a 6-point scale, all of that. So it's a long and complicated process. And the guidelines that I sent last night will help people think through that, and then looking at sample scoring guides will do that. Other concerns?
Doug, a couple of more questions.
Yep, sure.
There's a question coming in that which assessment items do you think are the best for crowd that is carrying out blue-collar jobs? And
your voice cut out. Could you say that one more time?
Skill competencies.
Okay.
What, according to you, would be the
I'm
best
sorry.
would be best for this segment that is carrying out blue-collar jobs?
So wait, okay, I heard blue collar jobs, and the question is which assessment or which kind of assessment? Is that the question?
Which kind of assessments? Yes.
Yeah. To me, again, and all of this, I'm going to be very careful to say there isn't a best. There's always compromises. There's the best you can do, best logistically. There are practical considerations. I would think for a blue collar job, the best test to give would be a sample activity that's typical of the kind of skill you're expecting someone to do. Now, that's hard to score, hard to create the environment. The next best bet would be questions that kind of get at what I would call the non-cognitive, sort of the questions about, and we'll look at that on Thursday, the ability, the tendency to work hard, to come to work on time, and there are a lot of ways to get at those skills. That is basically, are you going to show up and are you going to work hard? Something about learning. So you would give a picture or a guide or a map or a graph and ask questions that show, can a person look at directions and understand how to follow them? Now that's take something like car repair, automated car repair. The best way to test it would be to have an engine, standardized mistake in it, some flaw, the carburetor's not connected, or there's this or that, and say, diagnose the problem. That's a very hard test to create, very hard to score, but it's what you really want the person to do. If you can't do that, you might say, okay, let's show them a picture of an engine and say, this is the symptoms. When you turn the key, you get the following sound. What do you think is most likely the cause? And then you can find out if they have those diagnostic skills, at least in theory. But any of these is in some sense a compromise from what you really want, which is put the person in the job and see if they can do it well. And that is a real challenge. So we do a lot of, but you also have to be careful. Years ago, I think ETS actually worked on it. There was a test for custodians, basically, cleaning and maintaining schools, school janitors, and they gave them a test of quant, mathematics, and of writing and reading. Well, those aren't skills you need to be a janitor. So what it did was it kept people out of the job who were fully qualified, but who didn't have academic skills. And in the United States, that got further complicated because it became very racially biased, so that African Americans tended not to have the academic skills. They're perfectly capable, but they were kept out. So there were major legal lawsuits and problems. You have to be careful you're not measuring something that isn't what it is you want to measure. So I sent earlier, and it's in your materials, a thing on praxis. We are very careful to do job analyses to say, what really do you want this person to do? So an auto mechanic, you may not need to have any oral communication skills at all, or you might need to have minimal ones where you can understand directions. That's all part of the test construct evidence-centered design process, identifying what is really the skill you want and how can you now test that.
Sure. That's helpful. Another question, Doug, coming up is sort of a recheck, but I'll just put out the question for you, if you could help us with that. The approaches we discussed here are more inclined towards the mainstream assessment. So do you think that the approaches would work for skill assessments as well?
What kind of assessments as well?
The competencies based assessment. Do you think these approaches would work for competency testing?
Yes, I think, but again, you have, no, I think it's absolutely essential to follow these processes for competency, because that's where you really want to know what is the competency you're saying you're measuring. What you start with is somebody who has this competency can do what that somebody who does not have it cannot do. What is that exactly? Find that out. And then how do we measure that? And how do we give them a sample to show whether or not they can do that? Evidence-centered design is more needed for the non-mainstream, because by now we all kind of know what it takes to measure writing, reading, math, history. Those are all been done for so many years. Employment competencies are much trickier, and you have to really, decide what are those skills that you need. And there are many, many licensure assessments, not so much from ETS, but definitely in the United States. Everything from medical school to barber shops to auto mechanics. And increasingly, large employers like Amazon and Google are giving competency tests to their employees who want to rise in the organization. And there's more and more learning on the job with assessments. And that is, I think, the future of employment, because what you want are people not who know things, but people who are capable of learning things. So to go back to it, yes, you really want to be very, very precise in how you define the competency. And yes, these methods can be are perfect for that, or necessary.
Okay. So there's a lot of science behind it. Moving on to the next question. If you would like to tell us or throw some light on what could be the common errors and biases that the test developers could be careful about while designing constructed response questions and the rubrics around it.
Yeah, and I think this is an important one. I mean, I think I said on last Thursday, fairness is probably the biggest driving concern at ETS for all assessments. And you have to be very careful about bias and be very careful what it is. So this is, again, the concept behind evidence-centered design. In the 1940s or 50s, people just said, oh, I know what a smart student should know. They should know how to play polo. They should know New York City. They should understand art. Well, it turns out those were all skills, not that were necessary for college, but which were known by the affluent, powerful, mostly white males. And so there's a lot of bias. To get rid of bias, you have to, again, there's two things. You want to look at the test makers should represent the population they're testing. There should be people from all varieties of backgrounds. They also should be statistically analyzed to see are any groups being disproportionately impacted. The old definition of validity was you're measuring what you say you want to measure. The new one is the consequences of the test are doing what you want it to do. So bias is something very important to look at. And again, the best way to deal with that is to have people from different perspectives, different backgrounds, so you don't have all the people making the test come from the same worldview who then will end up representing a biased point of view. Does that help at all? Any other questions? These are good. And by the way, I don't even know how to pronounce the viva voce, the oral assessment of people. The one issue there is you want to really, really train the assessors. I think we talked about this a bit Thursday, to make sure they're very standardized in how they ask, how they respond to the test taker's response, that they're always doing the same thing. You don't want somebody, it's very, I mean, this is a problem with job interviews, is that if I go in for a job interview and the guy who interviews me is my age, my background, he talks to me, he says, oh, I'd like to play golf. And I say, hey, I like to play golf. We could have great rapport. And then somebody else comes in who doesn't play golf, who's different gender, different race, and the guy that has nothing to say, then you're going to end up thinking the person's not qualified for the job when it has nothing to do with the job, being able to talk about golf. But that bias is something you have to consciously and constantly work to avoid.
Sure. I think that's interesting and helpful also. And, taking from the same topic, which we're talking about, Viva part, where the test scorer basically evaluates the test takers on the certain interaction, based on questions that are put up by the assessor. So in that process, what we have also commonly seen is that there are sometimes leading questions that the assessor tends to use. So we would like to know your perspective on, is it okay? Is it acceptable for an evaluator or a rater to use leading questions to help or maybe just encourage the the candidate or the test taker to come up with a level of answering at all there are certain challenges?
The one kind of answer I would have is, to the degree that it can be standardized, sure. But think of it, if it were a written test, you wouldn't want me to get a written test that asked a good leading question to help me, and you got a written test that didn't. It would be the same test. We would never have that. So you have to be very careful that an assessor doesn't help along somebody he kind of likes and not help along somebody he doesn't like. And that you have to say, these are the questions you're supposed to ask. No other questions, no other intonation. But that's very, very tricky because there's body language, there's all kinds of things going on. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but you have to be careful. In the 19th century, there was a horse that was able to count and do math. And it turns out the horse was very finely attuned to the master's body language, and the master would kind of relax when the horse tapped his leg enough times to be the answer, and the horse just learned that's when you stop. No one knew that. Once they separated the master from the horse wasn't able to do very good math. So you have to be careful about that effect. You don't want to have the assessor saying, well, what about if you do this, and helps that person, but doesn't do the same thing. So my answer would be, you should have a written down set of questions that are exactly the same for every candidate and every assessor. Does that make sense? It's got to be standard. You can't have variance.
Sure. I think that's really useful and helpful for in our case where viva voce is very commonly used, and it's spoken. It's all verbal communication and interaction. So we do understand the importance of standardizing that part. The next question, Doug, I would like to ask is on the reliability on rating the response. We know that the process of rating the response has to be highly reliable, that a test taker's score must be as nearly as possible same, no matter which individual scorer is rating the test. So how do you think, what are your views and points in order to keep the reliability factor of, scoring up and, overall to cover that part? Yes.
It's an excellent question. The guidelines I just sent yesterday lay out a lot of the theoretical, and we have numerous articles at ETS.org, research studies on what we call IRR, or inter-rater reliability. So yes, it's essential. Back in 1963, we brought in a whole bunch of English teachers and gave them a bunch of essays and said, score these on a 1 to 9 rating, and gave them no training, no scoring guide, no samples, and no response. I think every single response received every single grade from one rater or another. And there was almost no agreement. Now, that just obviously isn't acceptable for a standardized test. So the way you work around it is, again, you start with a scoring guide, and raters need to really be trained on that. And then what you need are really good examples of responses, and say, this is a good example of a 5, and this is why it's a 5 and not a 6, and why it's not a 4. And we have elaborate training for all of our raters to do that. And because we're a testing company, we have tests. So before somebody can read one of our essays for a program, they have to pass a certification test where we give them 30 responses and say, score them. And if they can't score them accurately, they get more training. And until they can, they're not allowed to. And then every single day, when they come to start scoring, they're given a small test called the calibration test, where, again, if they don't get a high enough score, they're not allowed to score the essays. Then while they're scoring the essays, we include responses that we've already scored ahead of time and have agreed scores. They don't know that. And we can see, oh, we had a paper that should have gotten a 4. This rater gave it a 2. And again, more training. And if the person can't, with training, improve, well, then we dismiss them. So working on inter-rater reliability is really, really essential. And the only way to do it is to have some really good training. And one way to do that would be to videotape the assessor asking questions and have different people's level of response, and then say, okay, people, you're going to be an assessor. Watch these videos. Now I want you to score them. What would you give this person? What would you give this person? If they can't follow this training and the guidelines, they're not ready to be an assessor. But that's an elaborate and detailed and ongoing, by the way. So we keep refreshing and testing them daily.
Okay, that's pretty interesting.
Yep. It's
that
hard.
will take, yeah, it's hard. And training in the Indian skill ecosystem, the short-term skill ecosystem, there's a lot of training that happens on developing the right qualities of an assessor. So I think that your point on the reliability aspect would come in really handy and useful for our
Yes.
sector skill councils who are in the, who are forward to develop the right competencies in these assessors. We'll take the one last question, today, and that's not really based on the topic, but it's more relevant to the current environment because we are undergoing precedented times where, the challenge is put in front of us due to COVID and their crisis around it. So there are a lot of organizations who are operating in the assessment space. They're asking your views as a leader. What are your recommendations for any assessment organization to, consider and have in mind to really ride this COVID wave and the crisis time? Any view on that? Any comments from your side on that part? Yeah.
I think if I really did, I would be president of the company. No one knows the answer to that question. It's a really hard one. I can tell you this, the COVID-19 is changing everything having to do with education and everything having to do with assessment. And no one really knows how profoundly or where we're going to be. But I think on Thursday, or maybe when we talk separately, one of the ways we've responded is by giving at-home assessments. And that's how the College Board did. And I'm guessing this will be the future, this technology. Right now, my father could not have believed that I could be sitting in my home talking live with people in Delhi. That would just be, he couldn't have imagined that. Things have changed. And now I see my family once a week on Zoom. That didn't exist a while ago. My wife's a professor, and she is now learning how to teach complicated cultural classes online. And my daughter is taking classes online. We're all changing. So my guess is that assessments will increasingly be moved to where they're on video, they're on proctors. It's just going to be a different environment. So right now, if you take the GRE or TOEFL at home, you have to have a special room. There's a live proctor who's looking through the camera to see that there's no one else in the room. If you are seen looking down and peering, your score is canceled. All of these things are being done for security reasons. And I'm thinking there's going to be just more and more smoothly running ways to allow for at-home testing and at-home learning and at-home working. I mean, the jobs are changing too. Some, maybe blue collar more or less than others, may change less or more, but a lot of jobs are going to be a different kind of skills. And some of the skills are going to be, how do you do collaborative problem solving with people who aren't in the same room? That's a real skill. We're going to talk Thursday about collaborative problem solving, where we have our test takers as a group have to solve a problem and they don't get to see each other. They're in different places on computers, and it's a skill that you're going to need in the 21st century. So I think that's one part of the whole COVID-19. It's who knows what else. But technologies keep changing things. That's no question.
All right. So with this, Doug will end the event today.
Okay.
And I thank you a lot for sharing great insights on the critical thinking assessment and especially on the rubric. I think those points are really helpful. And the questions that have come today are also very interesting. You've really taken a lot of time in explaining the points to us. Really appreciate that coming in from you. I would like to tell the participants here who are present right now that we're going to meet again coming Thursday, same time, 4:30 p.m. by Indian Standard Time. And we're going to talk about new advancements in assessments. And Doug is going to take us through some very, very interesting new initiatives and advancements in assessments that ETS has come across. On that note, there is a feedback link that has been shared in the right panel on your screens for attendees to let us know what you think, what you'd like to know more about, what are the takeaways, and really appreciate you all being here and with us. Do let us know if you have more questions. We'll be happy to take it through Doug and have it answered. With that, thank you, Doug, and thank you all the attendees. Team NSDC signing off.
Everyone have a good evening. For me, my day is just beginning.
Okay, have a good day to you.
All right. Did you want me to stay on after this, or or let me know by email if there's anything special for Thursday you would like?